The year was 2847, and humanity had finally found its place among the stars. For 200 years, humans had walked alongside 4 to 7 different alien species as equals in the Great Galactic Council. Peace had become normal. Trade flourished between worlds. Children grew up knowing that the universe was vast and filled with friends, not enemies. On the agricultural colony of New Hope, the morning sun rose over fields of golden grain that swayed in the gentle breeze. Human families had built their homes here alongside alien neighbors. The Vraxians ran trading posts in town. The Kelthani worked the farms with human settlers. It was a place where different species lived together without fear, without hatred, without violence. 8-year-old Jack Thompson ran through the marketplace with his friends, human and alien children playing together as they always did. His older sister Emma, 16 and responsible, watched from nearby while helping their mother sell vegetables from their farm. It was an ordinary day, peaceful and warm, just like every other day on New Hope. Nobody noticed the ships descending from orbit at first. When the alarms finally screamed across the colony, it was already too late. The Zelthic corporate fleet had come, and they had come with purpose. Their own worlds were dying from resource depletion, their economy collapsing under the weight of poor decisions made generations ago. They needed leverage, something to force the Galactic Council to give them what they wanted. They needed hostages. The Zelthics had chosen to ignore the warnings. They had dismissed the old stories as mere legends meant to scare primitive species. The first law of the galaxy was clear and absolute. It had been written in the Council's founding documents and repeated in every treaty since. The law stated simply that human children were never to be harmed, never to be threatened, never to be taken. But the Zelthics were desperate, and desperate beings often make terrible choices. Their soldiers moved through the marketplace with cold efficiency. They carried weapons that stunned rather than killed, nets that captured rather than injured. They were careful not to harm the children they seized. 23 human children were taken in less than 10 minutes, including Jack and Emma Thompson. The Zelthic commander believed he was being merciful by not hurting them. He would soon learn that mercy means nothing when you cross the line that should never be crossed. On the Council station orbiting the neutral world of Harmony Prime, Ambassador Marcus Stone received the emergency transmission and felt his blood turn to ice. He was human, but he had spent 30 years working with alien species, building bridges of understanding and friendship. He knew what was about to happen. He had studied the history that most humans prefer to forget, the dark chapters from the early days of first contact. Marcus immediately requested an emergency session with the Zelthic Corporate Council. He spoke through the communication array with urgency in his voice, begging them to understand the magnitude of their mistake. He told them about the first law, about why it existed, about what would happen if they did not immediately return every child unharmed. The Zelthic representatives laughed at him. They had never seen humans fight. Their species had evolved past warfare 1,000 years ago. They resolved all conflicts through economic pressure and negotiation. The idea that humans would actually resort to violence over a mere 23 children seemed absurd to them. They offered to negotiate terms for the children's release in exchange for resources and territory. Marcus tried again, his voice shaking now with barely controlled emotion. He showed them historical records, footage from humanity's past conflicts, data on human psychology when their young were threatened. The Zelthics dismissed it all as propaganda, as exaggeration meant to intimidate them. In another part of the station, Warelda Vrenna of the Vraxian people stood before the full council assembly. Vrenna was old, very old, and she had been present during humanity's first contact war 300 years ago. She had seen what humans became when pushed too far. She had watched human soldiers fight with injuries that should have killed them, had witnessed human ships ram enemy vessels in suicide attacks when their weapons failed, had seen the cold determination in human eyes when they decided that something was worth dying for. Vrenna opened the classified archives, the records that were sealed away to prevent other species from ever making the same mistake again. The council members watched in growing horror as the images played across their screens. Cities burning. Fleets reduced to debris. The systematic and terrifying efficiency of human warfare when all restraint was removed. But even as Vrenna pleaded for immediate action, even as Marcus begged the Zelthics to reconsider, the news was already spreading across human space at the speed of light. Every human colony, every human ship, every human settlement received the same message. 23 children had been taken from New Hope. The first law had been broken. The response was not decided by governments or military commanders. It was instinctive, primal, and utterly unanimous. In the fleet yards of Earth, captains started their engines without waiting for orders. On Mars, civilian transport ships began arming themselves with whatever weapons they could find. In the outer colonies, mining vessels and cargo haulers turned towards Zelthic space. Humanity was moving, and nothing would stop them until their children came home. The galaxy was about to remember why the first law existed, and why it was the first law for a reason. The human fleet grew larger with every passing hour. It was not an organized military response. No president had declared war. No parliament had voted on military action. No general had issued marching orders. This was something deeper, something that bypassed all government and all reason. Every human who could reach a ship was heading towards Zelthic space, and nothing could stop them. Captain Elizabeth Walker stood on the bridge of the military frigate Valus Price and watched her tactical display with grim satisfaction. 3,000 human vessels had already gathered at the rally point near the border of Zelthic territory. More arrived every few minutes. Warships, transports, mining vessels, even luxury yachts modified with weapons that violated a dozen galactic treaties. The fleet was a strange mix of professional soldiers and angry parents, of trained pilots and shopkeepers who had never fired a weapon in their lives. Elizabeth had been a naval officer for 20 years. She had fought pirates and defended colonies from raiders. She had always followed orders, always maintained discipline, always believed in the chain of command. But when the news came about New Hope, when she learned that children had been taken, something ancient and terrible had awakened inside her. She had filed her flight plan and departed before her superior officers could even respond. They had not tried to stop her. They were already aboard their own ships. In the Galactic Council chambers, Ambassador Marcus Stone was losing his battle to prevent catastrophe. He had been arguing for 6 hours straight, his voice hoarse from pleading with the Zelthic representatives through the communication link. They still refused to understand. They kept talking about negotiations, about terms, about reasonable compromises. Marcus wanted to reach through the screen and shake them until they grasped the simple truth. There would be no negotiations. There would be no terms. There would be only one outcome unless they returned the children immediately. War Elder Vrenna sat beside Marcus, her alien features grave with concern. She had been trying to help, using her own influence to make the Zelthics listen. But they were a young species by galactic standards, foolish and arrogant in their ignorance. They had never faced real war. They did not understand that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The first contact between the human fleet and Zelthic forces happened at the edge of their territory. A Zelthic patrol of 6 ships encountered the human destroyer Relentless. The Zelthic commander opened a communication channel, ready to deliver a stern warning about entering their space without permission. He never got the chance to speak. The Relentless opened fire without warning, without hailing, without any attempt at communication. Its weapons were military-grade, designed for ship-to-ship combat, but they had been modified. The power output was beyond legal limits. The targeting systems had been set to maximum aggression. The destroyer's captain was a woman named Patricia Grant who had 3 children of her own back on Earth. She did not care about galactic lore anymore. She only cared about bringing the missing children home. The battle lasted 40 seconds. All 6 Zelthic patrol ships were destroyed. There were no survivors. No escape pods launched. No distress calls answered. The Relentless continued forward without slowing down, already targeting the next Zelthic position. When the news of the patrol's destruction reached the Zelthic Corporate Council, they finally began to realize their mistake. But pride and fear made them stubborn. They mobilized their defense fleet, 800 warships that had never seen combat but looked impressive in parades and demonstrations. They issued statements about defending their sovereignty and refusing to bow to terrorist demands. They still believed that a show of force would make the humans back down. Inside the detention facility on Zelthic Prime, Emma Thompson kept the other children calm. She had organized them into groups, the older ones watching over the younger ones. Jack sat beside her, trying to be brave even though his hands shook. The Zelthic guards had not hurt them. They had been given food and water. The cells were clean and the temperature comfortable. But they were still prisoners, still taken from their families, still terrified. Emma told the younger children stories to distract them from their fear. She told them about their parents and about human history. She told them that humans always came for their own, that no distance was too far, that no enemy was too strong. The children believed her because they had heard the same stories all their lives. Every human child grew up knowing what their species would do to protect them. Ambassador Marcus finally succeeded in convincing the council to take emergency action. They passed a resolution demanding the immediate release of all human children and promising protection to the Zelthics from human retaliation if they complied. The vote was unanimous. Every species in the council understood now that this was not a political crisis or a diplomatic incident. This was an extinction event waiting to happen. The resolution was transmitted to the Zelthic Corporate Council with urgent priority. Marcus included one final message, a personal plea from one diplomat to another. He told them about human evolution, about how humans had climbed from prey species to apex predators over millions of years. He explained that the instinct to protect human young was not cultural or learned but genetic and absolute. He begged them to understand that they were not facing a government or an army. They were facing an entire species that had just been told their children were in danger. The Zelthic leadership read the message and finally felt the first true stirrings of fear. They looked at their defense fleet and suddenly realized it would not be enough. The human fleet arrived at Zelthic Prime like a storm made of metal and fury. Captain Elizabeth Walker watched from her command chair as 8,000 human vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. The number had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. Ships kept arriving from every corner of human space, drawn by an instinct older than civilization itself. The Zelthic defense fleet moved to intercept with 800 warships arranged in defensive patterns they had practiced for decades but never used in actual combat. Their commanders felt confident despite being outnumbered. Their ships were well maintained and their technology was proven. They had run thousands of simulations. They believed they could hold the line long enough for diplomacy to work. They were wrong about everything. The battle began without any declaration or warning. The human fleet simply opened fire at maximum range with every weapon they possessed. The Zelthics tried to follow their defensive protocols, tried to maintain formation and coordinate their responses. But human tactics made no sense by any civilized standard. Human ships accelerated directly into weapons fire, accepting damage that should have made them retreat. When their shields failed, they kept coming. When their weapons overheated, they rammed. A Zelthic cruiser found itself targeted by 5 human vessels at once. The cruiser's captain followed proper procedure, dividing his fire to drive them back. But the human ships did not retreat when damaged. One human destroyer took catastrophic hits that killed half its crew, yet it continued forward, its captain routing all remaining power to engines. It struck the Zelthic cruiser at full speed, and both ships exploded in a ball of superheated plasma. On the bridge of Valus Price, Elizabeth coordinated her wing while watching the tactical display with cold satisfaction. She saw human ships dying, saw the names of people she knew winking out of existence. But she also saw the Zelthic line collapsing, saw their formations breaking apart under the sheer weight of human aggression. The Zelthics fought like people who wanted to survive. Humans fought like people who had already decided that some things mattered more than survival. The space battle raged for 3 hours before the Zelthic defense fleet finally broke. Those ships that could still move retreated toward the planet, hoping that proximity to their homeworld would make the humans hesitate. They were wrong again. Human vessels pursued them through the orbital defense stations, firing continuously, destroying everything in their path. While the fleet battle consumed everyone's attention, something else was happening below. 50 human special forces teams had launched from hidden positions hours before the main fleet arrived. They came down through the atmosphere in stealth pods, using reentry trajectories that should have killed them but were calculated to avoid detection. 16 teams burned up during descent. The remaining 34 landed near the detention facility where the children were held. Lieutenant James Mitchell led Team 7 toward the facility's eastern wall. He had lost 8 of his 12 soldiers during the landing. His own left arm was broken from the impact. None of that mattered. He had seen the photographs of the children, had memoized every young face. His own daughter was safe on Earth, but these children belonged to his species, and that made them his children too. The assault on the detention facility was brutal and quick. The Zelthic guards were security personnel, not soldiers. They had been trained to handle prisoners, not repel military assault. The human teams came through walls and doors with explosives and weapons, moving with a speed that seemed impossible. Team 7 lost 4 more soldiers breaching the eastern wall. Team 3 lost everyone except their commander. But they kept pushing forward, kept moving toward where the children were held. Emma Thompson heard the explosions getting closer and pulled the younger children away from the door. She recognized the sound of human weapons, the particular rhythm of human combat. She began counting silently, estimating how long until the rescue teams reached their cell. Jack looked up at her with wide eyes, and she smiled to reassure him even though her heart was pounding. The cell door exploded inward, and Lieutenant Mitchell stumbled through with his weapon raised. His armor was scorched and his face was covered in blood, but his eyes were gentle as he looked at the children. He spoke softly, telling them they were safe now, telling them it was time to go home. Emma helped organize the younger children into groups while the surviving soldiers formed a protective circle around them. The extraction was desperate and chaotic. Human teams fought their way back to the extraction point while carrying children who were too young or too frightened to run. More soldiers died holding corridors so others could pass. Sergeant Linda Hayes stayed behind to cover a retreat, knowing she would not make it out. She was a mother of two, and her last thought before the ceiling collapsed on her was that someone else's children were getting home safely. Captain Elizabeth received confirmation that all 23 children were aboard rescue shuttles heading for the fleet. She felt a moment of relief so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. The children were safe. They had succeeded. But when she gave the order to withdraw, only half the fleet began to move. The other half continued their assault on Zelthic Prime, destroying orbital stations and targeting ground installations. Warelda Vrenna watched the battle from the Council station and felt her old hearts breaking. She transmitted human war footage directly to the Zelthic Corporate Council, hoping that showing them the truth would finally make them understand what they had awakened. The Zelthic leaders watched human soldiers fighting with fatal wounds, watched human pilots deliberately crashing their ships into targets, watched the cold efficiency of total war. The Zelthic Corporate Council broadcast their unconditional surrender on every frequency, begging for mercy they knew they did not deserve. Captain Elizabeth Walker received the surrender broadcast while standing on the bridge of Valus Price with the rescued children safely in the medical bay below. Her communications officer looked at her with uncertain eyes, waiting for orders. The Zelthic Corporate Council was begging for a ceasefire, offering complete capitulation, promising anything the humans wanted. Elizabeth's hand hovered over the fleet-wide command channel. She gave the order to cease fire. Her voice was steady and clear as she transmitted the command to all human vessels. But the response was not what she expected. Only half the fleet stopped shooting. The other 4,000 ships continued their assault as if they had not heard her at all. Some captains had disabled their command receivers. Others simply ignored orders that came from anyone except their own conscience. For 6 more hours, human vessels continued to tear apart Zelthic orbital infrastructure. Space stations that had stood for centuries became clouds of debris. Manufacturing facilities that had never known war burned in the vacuum of space. The Zelthics could only watch helplessly as their civilization was systematically dismantled piece by piece. It took direct intervention from Earth itself to finally stop the killing. The Human Defense Command overrode the targeting systems of every ship still fighting, forcing them to power down weapons whether their captains wanted to or not. The sudden silence after hours of continuous combat felt strange and hollow. The final count was devastating. 1,247 Zelthic vessels destroyed. 89 orbital stations crippled or obliterated. Estimated casualties near 400,000. Human losses were also terrible. 214 ships had been destroyed in the battle. 31,000 personnel had died, including most of the Special Forces teams that rescued the children. But every single one had been a volunteer. Every single one had known the risks. Every single one had decided that 23 children were worth dying for. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 3 days later. The chamber was filled with representatives from all 47 member species. The atmosphere was tense and uncertain. Nobody knew quite how to proceed. The Zelthic Corporate Council had been dissolved immediately after the surrender. Its former leaders sat in detention cells awaiting trial for violating the first law. But there was another question that needed answering. Some council members believed that humanity's response had been excessive, that destroying so much for so few was itself a crime worthy of punishment. They wanted to censure humanity, to place restrictions on human military capability, to ensure such destruction could never happen again. Ambassador Marcus Stone listened to the debate with growing frustration. He had spent 3 days without sleep, had exhausted himself trying to prevent this war, and now he had to defend his species for doing exactly what everyone had been warned they would do. When his turn came to speak, he stood slowly and looked around the chamber at all the alien faces staring at him with judgment and fear. He did not apologize. He did not make excuses. Instead, he reminded them why the first law existed in the first place. 200 years ago, during first contact, another species had made the mistake of harming human children. Humanity had responded with such overwhelming force that it shocked the entire galaxy into creating the first law as a protection, not for humans but for everyone else. The law was a warning label written in the blood of those who had learned the hard way. The Council had created that law because they understood something fundamental about humanity. Humans were not the strongest species or the smartest species or the most advanced species in the galaxy. But humans were the species that would burn down the universe rather than let their children suffer. That was not a flaw to be corrected. That was simply what humans were. Ambassador Marcus finished his statement with words that would be quoted for generations afterward. He said that humanity would not change its nature and would not apologize for protecting its young. The galaxy could accept humans as they were, or the galaxy could leave humans alone. Those were the only two options. Before the council could vote on any resolution, young Jack Thompson asked permission to address the assembly. The council chamber fell silent as the 8-year-old boy walked to the speaking platform with his sister Emma beside him. He was small and his voice shook slightly, but his words carried clearly through the chamber. Jack explained that the Zelthic guards had not beaten them or starved them or tortured them. They had been given food and beds and even toys to play with. But they had still been taken from their families. They had still been used as objects to trade and bargain with. They had still been treated as things rather than people. And humans did not forgive that. They could not forgive that. It was not in their nature to forgive threats to their children. War Elder Vrenna rose to speak after the children left the chamber. She was old and respected, and her words carried great weight among the council members. She proposed strengthening the first law with a new addendum. Any species that violated the protection of human children would forfeit all council protection from human retaliation. The galaxy would not interfere when humans did what humans did. The law would be enforced collectively to prevent humanity from having to enforce it alone. The vote was called. 4 to 6 species voted in favor. Only one species abstained, too frightened by what they had witnessed to make any decision at all. The message was clear and absolute. The galaxy would protect human children because the alternative was watching humans tear apart anyone who threatened them. The Zelthics would be rebuilt and reintegrated into galactic society under council supervision. But they would live forever with the knowledge of what they had awakened and barely survived. They would become the new warning, the new cautionary tale told to every species that joined the council. Never threaten human children. The first law existed for everyone's protection. 6 months had passed since the children came home. The colony of New Hope was rebuilding slowly, replacing the structures damaged during the raid with newer and stronger buildings. The fields were green again with growing crops. The marketplace buzzed with activity as human and alien vendors worked side by side just as they had before. But something had changed in the air, something invisible but always present. Everyone who lived there now understood that peace was precious because they had seen how quickly it could shatter. Jack Thompson ran through those same market streets with his friends, playing the same games they had played before the raid. But his mother watched him more carefully now. She always knew where he was. She always kept him within sight. All the parents on New Hope did the same. The fear had not left them, and perhaps it never would. Emma Thompson had changed the most. The 16-year-old girl who had kept the other children calm during their captivity had made a decision about her future. She enrolled in the Human Defense Academy the week after returning home. She was not alone. Applications to military service had increased by 400% across all human worlds. An entire generation had learned that safety required strength, and they were determined to become that strength. The rescued children became symbols throughout human space. Their faces appeared in memorial services and recruitment videos. They had not asked for this attention, had not wanted to be famous. But they understood why it happened. They represented every human child, and their rescue had cost 31,000 lives. That was a debt that could never be repaid but would never be forgotten. What surprised everyone was how humans responded to the defeated Zelthics. The species that had just devastated Zelthic civilization now sent the most humanitarian aid to help rebuild it. Medical supplies, construction equipment, food shipments, all came from human worlds in quantities that shocked the Galactic Council. Captain Elizabeth Walker personally commanded the first relief convoy to Zelthic Prime. The Zelthics did not understand. Their cultural psychology could not process why their attackers were now helping them survive. When a Zelthic diplomat finally gathered courage to ask Elizabeth directly, she gave an answer that would later be taught in xenopsychology courses across the galaxy. She explained that humans did not hate the Zelthics. Humans had simply responded to a threat against their children. Now that the threat was eliminated and the children were safe, there was no reason to let an entire species starve. The Zelthic diplomat asked another question, the one that truly haunted his people. He asked how humans could forgive what had been done. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment before answering. She told him that humans did not forget and would not forget. The memory of those 23 children being taken would remain in human consciousness forever. But humans understood that desperation had driven the Zelthics to break the first law. Humans could live with that understanding as long as it never happened again. A memorial was erected on New Hope in a quiet park near where the marketplace had been. It was not a monument celebrating victory or displaying weapons. It was a simple wall made of black stone with 31,000 names carved into its surface. Each name represented someone who had died to bring the children home. Soldiers and ship captains, engineers and medics, parents and grandparents who had volunteered knowing they would not return. The inscription at the base of the memorial read simply, "For them, we would burn galaxies. For them, we would face oblivion. For them, we are not alone." Every species in the Galactic Council sent representatives to the dedication ceremony. They came to pay respects but also to bear witness. They needed to see and remember why the first law existed. The Galactic Council officially reinforced and expanded the first law, now calling it the New Hope Doctrine. It was no longer just about protecting human children. The law was expanded to protect the young of all species that showed similar protective instincts. Research teams were commissioned to study which species had genetic drives to defend their offspring at any cost. Those species would be granted the same protections, the same warnings, the same understanding that attacking their children meant facing consequences beyond any normal warfare. Humanity gained a new reputation throughout the galaxy. They were no longer seen primarily as warriors or conquerors or even explorers. They were seen as proof that a species could be both civilized and fiercely protective at the same time. Humans built schools and hospitals across the galaxy. They participated in scientific research and cultural exchanges. They were good neighbors and reliable allies. But everyone knew what slept beneath that friendly surface, what could be awakened if the line was crossed again. War Elder Vrenna visited New Hope during the memorial dedication. She was old now, incredibly old, and this would likely be her last journey away from her homeworld. She stood in the rebuilt park with Captain Elizabeth Walker, watching Jack Thompson play with Vraxian and Kelthani children. The young ones chased each other through the grass, their laughter bright and innocent. They did not fully understand the significance of the memorial behind them or the history that had nearly consumed their worlds. Vrenna spoke quietly, her ancient voice thoughtful. She said that humanity terrified the galaxy, that entire civilizations now planned their policies around avoiding human anger. Elizabeth smiled, but there was sadness in her expression. She replied that fear was acceptable if it kept human children safe. Better that the galaxy feared what humans could become than risk learning that lesson through experience again. Vrenna nodded slowly, her alien features showing something that might have been respect or perhaps understanding. She said that this was exactly why the first law existed. Not to protect humans from the galaxy, but to protect the galaxy from what humans became when their children were threatened. The law was a shield for everyone, a boundary that maintained peace through clear understanding of consequences. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as the children continued playing. The memorial stood silent behind them, 31,000 names watching over the young ones who would never know the people who had died for them. It was as it should be. The children were safe, and that was all that mattered. That was all that had ever mattered. Retry.